Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the marble corridors of Renaissance Rome. The torchlight flickers against gilded ceilings, casting shadows that stretch like conspirators across the frescoed walls. You hear the shuffle of velvet slippers, the creak of heavy doors, and somewhere in the distance hushed voices layered with a strange mix of reverence and suspicion. The setting isn't a dungeon, nor a palace of worldly kings, nor the Vatican itself, but what we're about to walk through, is a story of saintly devotion or divine inspiration. Written a tale where ambition, bloodlines and whispered desires overlap in the most unsettling of ways, and at the center of it all is Pope Sixtus IV, a man who wasn't content to rule only as a spiritual shepherd, wanted to carve his family name into the very backbone of Italy. So, if you're into strange and fascinating tales from history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now let us walk into a papal court where nieces became bargaining chips, nephews became princes, and rumors whispered that love and politics were tangled in ways Rome could quite bear to write down openly. Pope Sixtus IV was born Francesco della Rovere in 1414, a friar of the Franciscan order, seemingly humble, committed to theology and preaching. But once he ascended to the papal throne in 1471, humility took a back seat. Like so many Renaissance popes, he saw the chair of St. Peter not just as a divine trust but as a family estate. And his family, della Rovere, were about to be planted across Italy like vines stretching from convent to castle. The logic was simple but ruthless. Rome was a dangerous city, filled with rival clans like the Colonna and the Orsini, families who had treated the papacy as a battleground for generations. Sixtus, sharp-eyed and ambitious, understood that if he wanted to secure his reign, he had to secure his bloodline. Nephews were suddenly cardinals, cousins were given bishoprics, but perhaps most intriguingly, his nieces were maneuvered like living chess pieces, their marriages aligning the papacy with noble houses who might otherwise challenge its power. One niece, Giovanna della Rovere, was married to Giovanni della Rovere, commander of the papal armies, effectively tying papal power to military muscle. Another, Caterina Riario, became entangled in political unions that pulled her directly into Roman most dangerous rivalries. The nieces carried more than beauty into their marriages. They carried the Pope favor, which in 15th century Rome was worth more than any dowry chest overflowing with gold. Now, if you're imagining these arrangements as tidy little ceremonies with flower petals and sweet hymns, think again. Marriage contracts in this era weren't just about love. They were weapons. Marry a papal niece meant access to favors, land grants, military protection, and in whispered corridors, more personal kinds of intimacy. Sixtus' involvement in these arrangements was so direct, so personal, that critics began to mutter about where influence ended and where forbidden affections might begin. One mainstream fact here: Sixtus IV was undeniably the architect of nepotism in Renaissance Rome. The very word nepotism comes from nepote, meaning nephew, but under his reign nieces were just as critical to the web. They were conduits of power binding, noble families like silk cords tied directly to the Vatican, and yet with every rope of silk came a knot of rumor when a pope is seen doting on his nieces, granting them extravagant wealth, and visiting them in ways that raised eyebrows. It doesn't take long for satire to sharpen its pen. Enemies whispered of incest, painting the pontiff as not just a sinner, but a hypocrite of the highest order. This wasn't whispered over glasses of wine in taverns alone. They crept into pamphlets, into political poetry, into the very culture of slander that fueled Roman gossip mills. A khaki tidbit, one of Sixtus' nieces, was said to have received an entire estate simply because the Pope declared her it jewel of the family crown. The irony, of course, is that the jewel seemed to shine far brighter in his personal company than was comfortable for public opinion. It read as if today's CEO handed half the company not to the board but to his niece, who just happens to visit his office every evening. Not exactly the stuff of holy austerity. The causes of this behavior were rooted in Renaissance politics. Rome wasn't just the head of Christendom, was a city of daggers hidden under cloaks. By elevating nieces and nephews, Sixtus was only indulging personal affection. He was building a fortress of alliances, one family marriage at a time. But the consequence was a swelling tide of resentment. Nobles saw their own daughters overlooked, their sons denied advancement, all because the papal bloodline took priority, and resentment in Renaissance Rome rarely stayed quiet. It often boiled over into feud, slander, and sometimes even blood in the cobblestone streets. An open scholarly debate hovers over these rumors. Did Sixtus IV truly cross the line into incest, or were the tales born of political enemies eager to stain his name? Historians disagree. Some point to his documented favoritism and unusual closeness. Others caution that Renaissance Rome thrived on exaggeration and scandal. As weapons of war, the truth, like a candle guttering in a drafty corridor, flickers just out of reach. Still, imagine yourself walking those corridors late at night. The Pope is not alone. His nieces, young and ambitious, glide through the Vatican in gowns of brocade, their laughter echoing against the frescoed walls. For a city always hungry for stories, it took very little to turn those echoes into accusations. And once a rumor took root in Renaissance Rome, it spread like ivy across marble, clinging, growing, impossible to scrape away. The stage was set, the marriages had been arranged, the wealth distributed, the suspicion seeded. For here, the story would fade, would thicken, deepening into whispered tales of knights behind closed doors, and a papacy increasingly defined not by its theology, but by the scandal of its bloodline. The papal apartments at night were not as silent as one might expect. Behind the heavy wooden doors, lined with velvet curtains to muffle sound, the Vatican seemed to hum with a peculiar life of its own. Guards stationed at corridors traded uneasy glances, not because they feared intruders, but because they had grown accustomed to odd visits, strange processions of relatives, and meetings that seemed less like holy councils and more like clandestine trysts. Pope Sixtus IV had surrounded himself with his family in a way that blurred the boundaries between private life and public office. His nephews were cardinals, generals, and courtiers. His nieces were elevated into noble marriages or placed strategically into convents that still offered influence. But the knights carried a different kind of rumor. Whispered tales suggested that some of these young women, his nieces, were not simply political instruments but companions in ways that made Rome murmur with disgust and fascination in equal measure. One particularly whispered story surrounded Caterina Riario, who married into the powerful Riario family. She was not only beautiful with the kind of striking presence that turned heads at court, but she also carried the special mark of being beloved by His Holiness. That phrase could have meant favor, patronage, or financial support, but in the mouths of Roman satirists, it took on a darker tone. Beloved, in the sense of intimacy, the corridors echoed, not only with hymns and prayers, but with laughter, footsteps, and the faint scrape of furniture late into the night. Now, one mainstream historical fact to anchor this: Pope Sixtus IV is widely documented as the founder of nepotism within the papacy. He gave out benefices, bishoprics, and cardinalships to his nephews with a kind of reckless generosity that shocked even jaded Romans. If he was willing to twist sacred offices for blood, relatives, critics reasoned, why not other boundaries as well? In their eyes, the very pattern of corruption became evidence for darker sins. The stories of whispered knights in the Vatican always returned to the same theme: the Pope's unusual closeness to his female kin, while male relatives received formal promotions. The women appeared to receive personal affection, lavish gifts, and frequent audiences. Rome, being Rome, needed little else to fuel its imagination. One satirist scribbled that the Pope cares more for the warmth of nieces than for the chill of Christ and tomb. It was crude, biting, and it circulated quickly in a city that thrived on scandal, like bakers thrived on flour. What makes these tales even stranger is the Renaissance culture of rumor itself. We might think of gossip as a kind of light entertainment, but in 15th century Italy it was political whipmanship. A joke, a slander, or a bawdy story could damage reputations, ruin alliances, and tilt power balances. Enemies of the Della Rovere family had every incentive to spread such whispers. Yet, the Pope's own actions did little to extinguish them. He did not retreat into solemn dignity. He seemed almost to enjoy the opulence and theatricality of his court. When courtiers saw nieces escorted into his chambers, the line between rumor and reality became hopelessly blurred. A cocky tidbit here: Sixtus IV ordered the construction of the Ponte Sisto, a bridge still standing in Rome today, financed partly by taxes on prostitution. Imagine the irony: while his building projects were funded by the wages of Roman sex trade, rumors claimed that his private indulgences mirrored the very vice he taxed. It is as though he built monuments to his reign on the very whispers that undermined His Holiness. The joke practically wrote itself for Roman sharp-tongued poets. Of course, historians today remain cautious. Did the Pope truly engage in incest with his nieces? Or were the tales exaggerated, crafted by rivals like the Medici or the Colonna to smear his reputation? Scholars argue both ways. Some note that Renaissance elite often blurred familial and romantic closeness. Public displays of affection, kisses, and shared lodgings that might seem scandalous to us were in fact common. Others counter that Sixtus IV's record of brazen nepotism, and the sheer persistence of these rumors suggest there was at least a kernel of truth. The debate remains open, flickering like a candle behind stained glass, with shadows suggesting more than they reveal. Yet for contemporaries, nuance did matter. The perception was reality and the perception was scandalous. Rome whispered that the papal chambers, meant to be sanctuaries of prayer, instead echoed with softer, more intimate exchanges. It didn't help that Sixtus showered his nieces with jewels, estates, and public titles far beyond what most women of the time could expect. Every necklace, every brocaded gown, every gilded coach rolling through Rome became another piece of evidence in the eyes of a suspicious public. Consequences began to ripple outward. Those who married the papal nieces into their families felt both elevated and endangered. On one hand, they gained access to the popedom patronage. On the other, they risked being mocked as cuckolds, their wives suspected of being too close to His Holiness. Imagine being a powerful Roman noble, strutting through the streets in armor, yet constantly hearing whispers that your wife was but the popedom favorite. In a city built on honor and appearances, this was as much a wound as any blade could inflict. The Vatican, outwardly a fortress of marble and fresco, became in the popular imagination a brothel dressed in holy robes. And while the Pope continued to preside over masses, bless the faithful and extend indulgences, the stain of rumor clung tighter each year. Even his genuine achievements, like founding the Sistine Chapel, the jewel of Renaissance art, could not fully drown out the murmurs. It was as though every brushstroke of fresco carried not only the image of the divine, but also the shadows of whispered nights no one dared speak of aloud in public sermons. Step by step, the private life of the Pope and his nieces became indistinguishable from his political strategy. You understand his reign, one must understand both. To power he sought to wield through bloodlines, and the scandal that grew like ivy across the walls of the Vatican, clinging even to the stones of St. Peter's Basilica. And in that tension, between sacred duty and forbidden whispers, Rome found the perfect fuel for satire, gossip, and rebellion alike. The slanders didn't stay confined to dimly lit taverns or whispered gossip behind church columns. They began to spill out into pamphlets, poems, and satirical dialogues, sharpened by the pens of Roman literati and embittered enemies of Pope Sixtus IV. Section 2 was the hushed sound of footsteps echoing in papal corridors. Section 3 is the scratching of quills on parchment, public ridicule turned into a weapon. Rome in the 1470s and 1480s was alive with writers who thrived on lampooning the powerful niece. Men, and sometimes women, had little to no formal outlet for dissent, so they used biting satire as their sword. The accusations of incest, lust, and nepotism surrounding the Pope were too juicy to resist, and because many of the Pope's own policies had created bitter enemies, the environment was ripe for ridicule. Imagine if today political cartoonists were armed not just with ink and caricature, but with the ability to spread scathing rumors that could alter the balance of power in an entire city-state. Mainstream history confirms one key point here. Sixtus IV was directly involved in the infamous Pazzi Conspiracy of 1478, when he supported an attempt to assassinate Lorenzo de Medici and his brother in Florence. This was no gentle spiritual leader. This was a pope deeply entangled in blood politics. For enemies like the Medici, but as morally degenerate, gave them double ammunition, was both a threat to their lives and a stain upon the church itself. It was in this climate that poets and critics unleashed their fury. Pasquinades, satirical verses nailed to the betalking statues of Rome, became particularly vicious under Sixtus IV. One verse mocked the Pope's fondness for his nieces, suggesting they were more often in his bed than in their husband-in-arm. The humor was crude, but in Renaissance Rome, crude humor stuck. Citizens would gather to read these public jests aloud, laughing in the shadow of the very papal palaces they mocked. Enemies weaponized ink, as surely as daggers cardinals who lost influence. Noble families shut out of papal favor, and rivals abroad all joined in amplifying the scandal. The Pope was painted not just as corrupt, but as grotesque, an uncle turned lover, a shepherd who devoured his flock. One satirical dialogue even depicted a fictional pope asking his nieces to share their prayers in private chants, a line that barely concealed its innuendo-guinty detail. The Roman statue known as Pasquino, battered and half-ruined, became the city's unofficial newsstand. Anonymous poems were pasted to its torso, so consistently mocking papal scandals that locals joked the statue itself spoke the truth Rome dared not say aloud. So yes, even broken marble joined the chorus against Sixtus IV. And yet, the strange thing about satire is that it often contains slivers of truth. Did Sixtus really sleep with his nieces? Historians hesitate, reminding us that slander in Renaissance politics was a staple tactic. But the persistence of the story petered across multiple sources, in rival courts, and among inter-popey behavior, fed the flames. His open favoritism, lavish gifts, and repeated visits to his nieces gave rumor all the material it needed to grow. The consequences of this ridicule were profound. For the Pope himself, they chipped away at his moral authority. A pontiff accused of incest could hardly claim the mantle of Christum representative on earth. Some found themselves reduced to scandalous caricatures, their actual lives overshadowed by crude jokes in verse. Their husbands, meanwhile, became objects of mockery. Powerful men mocked as powerless in their own households. In a culture obsessed with honor, this ridicule could wound deeper than a blade. What made the satire particularly dangerous was its ability to travel. Poems, mocking the Pope, were copied and carried from Rome to Florence, from Venice to Naples. The wider Italian states chuckled at Roman incestuous pontiffs. Even as they weighed alliances and wars, scandal was not just an embarrassment, it was a liability in diplomacy. If a pope was painted as morally unfit, it gave rival states more confidence to resist his decrees. An open scholarly debate emerges here. Were these satirical attacks coordinated by powerful enemies like the Medici, or were they truly the spontaneous voice of a disillusioned Roman populace? Some argue that only a coordinated propaganda machine could spread such persistent stories across Italy. Others counter that the corruption of Sixtus IV's court was so obvious that satire arose naturally, like mold in a damp cellar, unavoidable. The debate lingers, showing just how tricky it is to untangle truth from performance in the Renaissance. And yet, the performance itself mattered. Rome was just ruled by swords or coins, was ruled by reputation. The Pope, who built the Sistine Chapel and commissioned grand projects, was in equal measure the Pope mocked as a lecherous uncle. One hand raised Christendom and greatest works of art. The other, according to rumor, reached for the bedsheets of his own kin. That paradox became the very story of his reign. The pens of his enemies made sure the whispers of Vatican knights never faded into silence. They were inked onto stone statues, sung in taverns, and scribbled in margins of letters carried by merchants across Europe. The Vatican could silence dissenters with prisons or even executions, but it could never silence a good dirty joke, and Sixtus IV had given Rome the material for centuries of them. Step by step, what had begun as whispered rumors in corridors had now become permanent graffiti on the reputation of the papacy. And once a story becomes public ridicule, it's by nearly impossible to erase. The laughter of Rome, cruel, relentless, echoing against marble walls, was in some ways louder than the Popine decrees themselves. The papal palace was not a bubble sealed off from the rest of Italy. Every decision, every scandal, and every rumor flowing through its gilded halls spilled outward, seeping into the veins of the peninsula. Our rival families, if the Pope loved his nieces too, openly lavished them too richly, or arranged their marriages too strategically. The consequences were never confined to gossip alone. They were political tremors shaking entire city-states and setting off conflicts that drew blood on cobblestone streets. Sixtus IV nepotism created a network of family alliances that blurred the line between private desire and public policy. His nieces were linchpins in this design. When Caterina Riario married Giuliano Riario, the Pope's nephew, the union seemed like an elegant consolidation of power. Caterina carried the aura of papal favor, while Girolamo, armed with titles and papal wealth, became a formidable political actor. Together, they formed a couple that stood at the intersection of Roman whispered scandal and Italy violent rivalries. But such marriages were not love stories, they were matches lit in a powder keg. The Riario family quickly became one of the most hated in Rome, notorious for greed, cruelty, and arrogance. Caterina herself, while admired for her wit and resilience, was swept into this storm. Her connection to the Pope made her both untouchable and a target. The subject of cruel jests that implied her rise was not through virtue but through her uncle bedroom. One came stream, historical fact, to goose the volatility of these alliances. In 1478, the Pazzi Conspiracy exploded in Florence, painted by Sixtus IV, and orchestrated by his relatives, including Girolamo Riario. The plot aimed to assassinate Lorenzo de Medici and his brother Giuliano. Inside the Florence Cathedral, Giuliano was murdered, stabbed 23 times before the altar. Lorenzo escaped with wounds, furious and vengeful. The result was war. Florence versus the papacy. Roman reputation drenched in blood as much as in scandal. Imagine the optics. A pope accused of sleeping with his nieces was simultaneously orchestrating one of the most infamous murder plots in Italian history. For his enemies, the two stories fused perfectly. Here was not Christian vicar, but a man ruled by lust and greed, a puppet master willing to sacrifice kinship, covenant and cathedral sanctity alike. Quirky tidbit. After the Pazzi plot failed, Lorenzo de Medici staged public mock trials of papal agents, including priests, hanging them in Florence streets. The Florentine crowds jeered at the Vatican more. Holy assassin, and the jokes about the patron nieces resurfaced as insults, shouted beneath dangling corpses. The mockery wasn't just literary anymore, it was staged with bodies twisting in the Tuscan sun. As the wars unfolded, Caterina Riario emerged as a striking figure. Later celebrated as Caterina Sforza, she would prove herself a fierce commander and regent, defying besieging armies from the battlements of Forlì, but in the 1470s and 1480s, her reputation was tangled in her papal uncle, and shadow enemies saw her less as an independent noblewoman, and more as the Sixtus IV personal entanglements could ripple into military campaigns and bloodshed. Open scholarly debate hovers here. Was Caterina merely a pawn in Sixtus IV dynastic games, or was she a shrewd participant, using her uncle of favour to carve her own path? Some historians argue she was a victim of political marriages, arranged without her agency. Others counter that her later actions, commanding armies, negotiating alliances, prove she learned early how to wield her papal connections for her own ends. The truth is likely somewhere in between, a mix of ambition, survival and circumstance. What is undeniable is that these marriages and entanglements poured gasoline onto Italy. The fragile balance of power, the Pope in private affections translated into public feuds, the Medici, the Pazzi, the Orsini, the Colonna. Every clan watched the Pope and nieces with suspicion, interpreting every gesture as a move in a game where one misstep meant death. And indeed, death was never far. Girolamo Riario was eventually assassinated in 1488, hacked down by enemies, in Folla. Caterina, widowed and besieged, seized control of the citadel, famously defying her attackers with a gesture so scandalous that it entered legend. But even her defiance was framed by her critics as the echo of papal arrogance, the same arrogance that had once whispered through the Vatican at night. For Sixtus IV, the bloodshed was both a triumph and a curse. He had bound his family into the very fabric of Italian politics, ensuring the Della Rovere aim would not fade. But he had also ensured that every feud, every murder, every war traced its origins back to papal nepotism, to nieces and nephews whose roles blurred the line between kinship and corruption by the late 1480s. Rome itself seemed weary. The grandeur of the Sistine Chapel, consecrated in 1483, stood as a testament to divine art. Yet the city end whispers still circled around the Pope and bedchamber. The irony was brutal. The same man who gave Michelangelo his canvas also gave Rome its crudest satire. Every brushstroke of fresco was accompanied by a joke about nieces and uncles, love and power, lust and legacy, and so the Vatican became not only a stage for spiritual authority, but also a theatre of scandal. Every niece-in marriage was another act in the drama, every feud a subplot, every war a climax. And through it all, Sixtus IV clung to his ambition, building monuments of stone even as his enemies painted him in filth. The fates of his nieces and nephews, proved to the Pope in private choices, had public consequences. The laughter of satirists and the blood of assassins were equally his legacy by the time his health began to falter. The story of Sixtus IV was not simply that of a Pope who reigned, but of a Pope whose family ambition set Italy ablaze, one scandal and one battle at a time. By the late summer of 1484, Pope Sixtus IV lay dying. The corridors of the Vatican, once so loud with footsteps, laughter, and rumour, now grew hushed. The courtiers who had once jostled for his attention tiptoed through the halls, whispering not about his health but about their own futures. For a pope whose reign had been defined by family ambitions, whispered scandals, and bloody rivalries, his death was not merely the end of a man, but the collapse of an entire system of nepotism that had bound Rome together in a tense, uneasy knot. The official chronicles note his death on the 12th of August, 1484. His body, swollen with disease and age, was laid out in state, yet even in death, respect was mingled with mockery. Romans were quick to voice their grievances. Crowds stormed through the city, looting the homes of papal relatives, tearing down symbols of the Riario family, and jeering that the reign of corruption had finally ended. It was as though the city had held its breath for 13 years, only to release it in a violent sigh of relief. Sixtus IV had achieved much in his lifetime. Mainstream history remembers him as the builder of the Sistine Chapel, a patron of Renaissance art, and a pope who transformed Rome into a city of marble and fresco. But the shadow side of that achievement was never forgotten. His nepotism, his political conspiracies, and the rumors of incest with his nieces became inseparable from his legacy. The Sistine Chapel itself, consecrated only a year before his death, seemed to mock him. A divine masterpiece dedicated to God, funded and overshadowed by a pontiff whose name became shorthand for corruption. In the months that followed, pamphlets and satires continued to circulate, cementing the image of Sixtus IV as a lecherous uncle rather than a holy father. His nieces, left as widows or pawns in the continuing struggles, bore the brunt of this reputation. Caterina Riario, soon to become Caterina Sforza, fought to preserve her territories, wielding the political instincts honed in her uncle at court. Her nieces faded into obscurity, remembered less for their own actions than for the scandals attached to their names. The irony of history is that Sixtus IV's enemies gained more from his sins than his relatives did. The Medici used his reputation as evidence of papal corruption, fueling the arguments that would later ignite the Reformation. Reformers like Martin Luther, decades later, pointed back to men like Sixtus IV as proof that the papacy had strayed too far into worldly lust and ambition. Thus, the whispers of incest, true or exaggerated, became part of a larger narrative that shook Christendom itself. A quirky detail lingers in Roman memory. The statue of Pasquino, battered and worn, continued to speak jokes about Sixtus even years after his death. Romans would paste verses mocking the Pope in supposed nights with his nieces, reminding everyone that while marble monuments endure, so too does scandal. The city that had mocked him in life refused to let him rest in death. An open scholarly debate still hovers over his story. Some historians argue that the charges of incest were little more than political propaganda, sharpened by enemies in Florence and Venice, who sought to discredit him. Others note that the consistency of the accusations, the extravagance of his gifts to his nieces, and the persistence of the rumors across indices said the extravagance of the rumors of his nieces. Was he guilty of forbidden intimacy, or merely guilty of creating the perfect conditions for such rumors to thrive? The question remains unanswered, suspended between archival fact and the theatre of Renaissance gossip. Yet, perhaps the real consequence is not whether the whispers were true, but how they shaped memory. For Sixtus IV, death did not close the book, it only underlined the margins with scandal. His marble monuments still rise in Rome, his Sistine Chapel still dazzles with celestial beauty, but his name is always mentioned with a smirk, a raised eyebrow, a suggestion of shadows behind the frescoes. Rome moved on, of course. New popes were elected, new scandals arose, new battles were fought, but Sixtus IV's reign remained a touchstone, a reminder of how the private affections of one man could spill into public wars, bloody conspiracies, and enduring mockery. His nieces, whether victims or accomplices, became unwilling co-authors of a story that blurred the line between family and forbidden. And so his legacy lingers, not as a clean narrative of saintly devotion, but as a tangled knot of beauty and corruption, sacred art and sordid rumor. A pope who gave the world a Sistine Chapel also gave it the dirtiest jokes of Renaissance Rome. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of Sixtus IV, the paradox of a man who built in marble but was remembered in laughter. The night quiets, now the corridors dimming. We've walked with the Pope through his halls of power, listened to the laughter of his nieces echo in shadowed rooms, and read the ink of enemies who turned rumor into history. The story doesn't offer neat resolution. It leaves us with uncertainty, with whispers that refuse to die, with frescoes that glow above us while satirical verses crumble in the dust, but both survive in memory. Beauty and scandal side by side. Let the final image linger softly, a pope lying beneath gilded ceilings, his body still, his city restless, his name forever bound to both the marvel of the Sistine and the murmur of forbidden love. History doesn't always choose between truth and rumor. Sometimes it remembers both, like two voices singing off-key in the same darkened chapel. So close your eyes, let the whispers fade, and drift into the quiet knowledge that even the most powerful can never quite control how they are remembered. In the end, marble cracks, frescoes fade, and rumors live. The torches are gone now, their smoke curling away into silence. The marble corridors of the Vatican, once filled with whispers and scandal, now lie empty, save for echoes of the past. Imagine the sound of distant bells tolling slowly across Rome, a rhythm not of celebration but of closure. The Pope in footsteps no longer press against the stones. His nieces' laughter no longer unsettles the night air. Only memory remains, drifting like incense long after the Mass has ended. The story we've traveled through tonight is not one of clarity but of shadows. It reminds us that history is rarely clean, rarely certain. It is built from the words of enemies, the exaggerations of poets, the suspicions of neighbors, and occasionally the truths too scandalous to put into official records. Sixtus IV, whether guilty or simply careless, became both a patron of beauty and a prisoner of rumor. The Sistine Chapel still soars in brilliance, yet his name is whispered with unease, a warning about how power and desire intertwine. As you drift toward sleep, Let your mind rest on the paradox. The Pope who gave us divine art was also remembered for human weakness. The city that mocked him could never deny his grandeur, and the artists who painted under his patronage could never erase the shadows cast by his life. In that tension lies the truth of Renaissance Rome, a world where splendor and scandal shared the same roof, where holiness and humanity were bound together like frescoes painted layer by layer. So breathe deeply, let the echoes soften, and allow yourself to drift away. His history will still be here when you wake, still full of whispers, still waiting to tell its stories.